This is the Haken Continuum Fingerboard. It's an electronic instrument with an extremely sensitive, continuous playing surface, and one of the most interesting and complex synths I've ever seen. It's got plenty of envelopes, LFOs, and synth engines, but if you ask me how many it really has, my answer will be, how many fingers you got? The Haken Continuum is an instrument hand-built by Lippold Haken for close to 20 years now, and has been in ongoing development even longer than that. It contains a built-in digital synth developed by Edmund Eagan, a composer and sound designer, and it's the combination of the two that makes it special. It can control other hardware and software synths, but it's at its best when the surface and the built-in synth are combined. Let's start with the surface. It's made of neoprene, so to get a sense of how it feels, it's the same material that diving suits are made of. The surface is stretched above hundreds of metal bars held by springs and sitting beside magnets, which are used to detect the slightest touch and movements. The result is a surface which, if you gently lay your hands on it, won't make a sound, but the slightest touch beyond that can be detected as hits, or slides, or gentle changes in pressure. Left and right motion is on the x-axis. Backwards and forwards is the y-axis. And pressure downwards is the z-axis. This information is sent both to the internal synth and can also be output through MIDI. So while the Continuum may look like a regular keyboard, it really shouldn't be compared to one. It's different in quite a few ways. For example, it can detect notes you press as discrete, specific notes. But if you want, you can completely get rid of that and just have it treat your touch as one continuous surface. And then it's up to you to find the right notes. Now you can round notes out if you want, completely. But then a lot of the magic is gone because it won't behave as a continuous surface. Having pitch behave fluidly like that makes vibrato very natural, as well as pitch bending. This makes pitch bending and vibrato very natural, whereas with a traditional keyboard, you just can't target notes or feel the vibrato like that. You can pitch bend chords too. The Continuum supports polyphonic expression. What that means is that all the modulations in any direction can happen per note. It means you can change the pitch on specific notes for individual vibratos and slides, unlike a traditional keyboard where once you pitch bend, you do it to all the notes. The same applies for y-axis motions, which means that with motions back and forth, each finger can be in a different place and create different sounds. Finally, with pressure, or z-axis control, the Continuum is very different too. Most keyboards will try and establish an initial velocity, and from there the note is static as you go along, or the envelope control is in the synth or whatever software you're using. Here, the envelope control is in your fingertips. You control it over time. You control how it starts, whether it's slow or fast. whether it decays slowly or quickly. And this is what I meant when I said your fingers are the LFOs and envelopes. Yes, the synth has those too, but the instrument really shines when you quite literally take these things into your hands. The only limitation that I saw with the Surface is that notes that are less than a semitone away can't be played together. I mean, you can play quickly like this, but once you press down on the Surface, the resolution, the notes need to be more than a semitone apart to be detected. I haven't found that to limit me, but I thought I should mention it. Okay, so that's it in terms of the Surface. Let's take a look at basic preset control. The Continuum doesn't have a built-in screen or knobs, so it's really best controlled by an external controller, whether it's a computer or iPad, and it also supports the BeatStep and a more expensive controller by Kenton. You still have basic control using the shortcuts printed here and the button on the left. So for example, if I wanted to change a preset, I press this button. Let's say I wanted to get to internal sound 253. I would need to press 100 twice and then 50 and 3, and then I get that. So it's pretty cumbersome to use this. It's workable, and there are some quick controls here, but you really want some external controller connected to it. This is what the main controls look like on the screen. You can choose 16 presets to have as your favorites here for quick access. So let's try this or this. And you can access all the presets by choosing a category and individual preset here. There are quite a few controls here. The interesting ones, occasionally on a preset, you'll see these controls. They let you they're sort of macros, or they're called barrels here, and they give you control, like for example, pitch control here. And these are different per preset. Ignore this area for a bit. Beside the barrels or macros, you also have effect controls. You can control the reverb, for example. Or add delay. There are several types of those. Aside from the computer, you can also control the Continuum using an iPad app. It gives you great access to preset selection and all the main control parameters, effect parameters, barrels, and so on. Another really cool Continuum feature is its external pedal support. You can plug in up to 2 expression pedals, and they can be modulators for any purpose, be standard sustain pedals, but also behave like a sostenuto pedal with volume control. So let me explain. Sostenuto is a fancy word for capturing particular notes, unlike sustain, which prolongs all the notes, and letting them sustain or drone out like what you're hearing here. Now, it works not just as an on-off pedal to create drones out of specific notes, but if you have an expression pedal, you can also control the level of the droning notes, which I think is really, really cool. Okay, let's talk about the internal synth. Now, you can use the Continuum to control any external hardware or software synth, but it really shines with its internal synth called the EaganMatrix. So let's start with an empty preset. And in no way am I going to pretend that programming the EaganMatrix is easy, but give me a couple of minutes and you'll see how powerful this thing is. So at its most simple form, the EaganMatrix is a modular synthesizer where you make connections between sources and destinations. And sources are listed here on the left and destinations on top. So for example, the first source is a noise generator. And if I want to hear it, all I need to do is connect it to either the left or right outputs. So let's do that. And I do that by just pressing 1, and if I gently increase the gain, you'll hear the noise. So that's nice, but not very exciting. So I will remove the 1. Now the beauty of the matrix is that you can also put formulas on the grid, not just values. And these formulas can take into consideration how you play on the continuum surface. So for example, if I were to put a Z instead of the 1, then the volume of the note will be determined by how hard I press on the surface. Now, noise isn't very musical, but if I take the x-axis parameter and plug that into the frequency of oscillator 1, and then connect that oscillator to the output, just like we did before, well, now you're talking. We can use this to also play chords if we want, because the EaganMatrix is polyphonic. And that's a nice instrument on its own. But let's make it more interesting. Let's take the y-axis and have that affect the timbre of the sound. All I need to do to make that happen is plug it into here. Now to take it a step further, you can add entire formulas to each of these intersection points, and these formulas can be sums or multiples of the XYZ parameters, as well as take into consideration a host of other things like envelopes, LFOs, the barrels or macros, expression pedal inputs, and more. Let me give you an example of this by adding a tremolo. So for that we need an LFO, and on the EaganMatrix we use shape generators, which can be either looping LFOs or one-time envelopes. Let's start with a fixed rate LFO at 5 hertz, which means 5 times per second. And now what we need is a formula that will take this LFO and multiply it by the pressure I'm applying when I'm touching the surface. Now for this I need to create a new formula, and I can use any one of the formulas here. Let's take A. I'll change it to a multiplication formula, choose shape generator as the source, and I'll take and make it a triangle LFO, and I'll multiply it by the pressure. When each of these elements on the formula is blue, it means that it's active. And finally, I need to add a trigger to the LFO. And for that, I'll use W, which stands for window, which means basically the window from when my finger touches the surface until it leaves it. And finally, I need to take this A formula and use it by replacing the Z's here with A's. Now, if all goes well, we have a tremolo. Now I want to add just one more layer of complexity here. I want the tremolo rate to be dynamic based on how hard I press the surface. So for that, I need to introduce a new element, a new formula, and I'll use B for that. This will also be a multiplication formula. Now I have to admit it does take a while to get your head around this, but it's not impossible. And in order to move the tremolo needle, I'll multiply the z-axis by 10. And this does require some experimentation. And then the final step here is to replace the 5 hertz constant with formula B. Now you'll notice as I touch the surface, the tremolo rate increases the harder I press. And that's how you create patches with the EaganMatrix. It's not exactly simple, but once you get the idea, you can go in and tweak existing presets and eventually maybe make some of your own. And if that's too hard, just pick a row that isn't used and you can add some EaganMatrix graffiti to it. Okay, so you heard me talk about LFOs and oscillators and filters, but I casually ignored these big banks on top. These 3 banks contain a world of synthesis options that are way beyond your standard synth. Rather than go through all the parameters, you can download the manual and have a look at that if you want. Let's just play a few presets that use these synth engines. I'm going to call them big banks instead of bi-quad banks if you don't mind. This is the scaled resonances big bank option, or a preset that was created using it. And A percussive sound can completely change character if you hold on to it. This preset is called French Sax, and it was created using the biquad mode bank. This one was created using the biquad mouth option. I think it pretty much speaks for itself. After the biquad banks, there are sine banks. This preset uses sine spray, rightfully called the bird echoer. This one uses wavebank. Next up, let's hear something using the harmonic manipulator, and the violin, viola, cello, bass preset is just a wonderful example of how this can sound like an instrument and behave like one. I'm no violinist, but with some practice this can sound really nice. And this is not sampled. I could go in and change the core engine, let's say, to alto sax, and it would sound completely different. Next up is the modal manipulator, and the harp is a really nice example for that. There's also a delay bank that can be used as a synth. That was based on voice delay, and the next one is based on summed delay. Micro delays are what you need for your next horror movie project. This next one messes around with bandpass filters. So much control at your fingertips. Aside from all that, there are some bonus synthesis methods that you can't really edit using the matrix, but give you a taste of what potentially may come in the future. This one is a great example.
Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay? Did you ever have a feeling that you wanted to go and still have a feeling that you wanted to stay?
The continuum has a touche mode. What this means is that you can use separate parts of the surface to determine which notes will be heard, and another to determine their timbre or gate. So for example, let's take this chord. left hand can also control its expression. So, that's just about the tip of the iceberg for what the EaganMatrix can do. The Continuum comes with about 300 presets, some of them very different from the others, like this one for example. And the Continuum really shines with the internal presets, but you can use pretty much any other external hardware or software synth. Some of the notable ones are the audio modeling virtual instruments. I played their double bass in the beginning of this clip. The Impact Soundworks instruments, I played their oud at the beginning of this clip. The Continuum comes with presets for Omnisphere and Contact, and notable MPE synths are Roley's Equator, which works well with this, the iPad apps Animoog and Moog 15, and GarageBand. The Continuum works well with modular synths, either with a module that Haken sell or with Expert Sleeper's FH1. So the last thing I want to talk about is price. There are a few other expressive quote-unquote instruments out there, but nothing quite like this. The Continuum has its flaws. I wish it had an internal display, I wish it had onboard knobs, but most of all I wish it were cheaper. This half-size version is $3,400, the full-size version is $5,300, so it costs more like a good saxophone than a cheap synth. The Continuum is expensive because it's handmade and it's not Lippold's day job. I just wish you would find a way to mass produce these or lower the costs, because I highly recommend this and it should be in the hands of more people. Got any questions? Hit me up in the comment section below. Hit like if you like this. Subscribe if you want to see more. Thanks for watching.